Hello, everybody. In this presentation, we're going to be introducing the Synoptic Gospels together and then introducing the Gospel of Matthew in particular near the end. Synoptic, where does that word come from, first of all? Well, if you look at the root here, the prefix syn, that means together. Optic, that might be a word you recognize as meaning seeing. So synoptic, you put those two together, means seeing together. For the most part, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar to each other and tell a similar story. They see the events of Jesus' life, his ministry, his death, his resurrection, very similarly, much more similarly than the fourth gospel, John, does. We'll see. We run into the synoptic problem here, though, as it's often called, and that's simply this. While on the one hand, they do see things together, they resemble each other very closely, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In fact, having some passages where there is exact verbal agreement, meaning they use the exact same words to describe certain stories. So these are verses that talk about Jesus healing a paralyzed man and a man with leprosy. They also, in other places, disagree quite extensively. So there might be, for instance, a story that appears in only one or two of these Gospels. And even in those stories where they share, the words they use might vary considerably. So the question further becomes, which one of these was first? And how did the other two later use that first Gospel of the three? A lot of New Testament scholars who study this over the years have said Mark is probably first. Mark is the one to give priority to. Historically, chronologically, it seems to make sense because it's the shortest, and that's what brevity means here. The brevity of Mark is a big reason for that. So you see that in this chart here. Mark is considerably shorter than Matthew, Luke. So the idea is Mark was written first, even though Matthew is the first gospel in the order of books we have. Mark historically came first. Matthew and Luke wrote their accounts later, largely basing a lot of their material on Mark, as you see here. Over 90% of Mark is duplicated in Matthew, 50 to 60, a little less in Luke, but they then added and expanded and put their own interpretive slant and style on their particular works. So Mark first, Matthew, Luke came later and added their own style and their own stories that they had been passed on by eyewitness testimonies. That's the idea. What about, though, the common material in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark? For instance, Matthew 3 and Luke 3 both have a story where Jesus is condemning the Pharisees and Sadducees as a brood of vipers, criticizing them quite harshly in those two passages. Mark does not have that story, though. So what some writers have suggested, what they've hypothesized, is there was another source that Matthew and Luke used, in addition to Mark, that often gets called Q. And Q stands for a German word. And that German word there you see, I'm not very good at pronouncing it, but it's something like Quelle. And that simply means source. So not a very original name, but if Quelle means source, let's take the first letter there, Q. And maybe what Q was a collection of Jesus' sayings, not a whole lot of stories in it, but lots of stuff that Jesus said, including the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, and maybe this particular passage in Matthew, Luke, among others. So here's a diagram to maybe visualize that. If Mark came first, Matthew and Luke used quite a bit of Mark. Matthew a bit more than Luke, as we saw earlier with those percentages. Maybe, though, there was this other source of Jesus' sayings called Q that Mark did not use, but that Matthew used a little bit of and that Luke used a little bit of, and that would explain why there are some things that Matthew and Luke share together that we don't find in Mark. And that, of course, leaves the green here just means that's unique to only Matthew. Mark and Luke do not have this. And the, teal color here for Luke, that's the unique stories that Luke alone tells that Matthew and Mark do not. So just diagramming here this two-source hypothesis. Here's a map of Galilee. The Synoptic Gospels present Jesus' ministry as mainly happening in Galilee, so this northern region of Israel. Here is Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. Here's Sepphoris, the city that the Romans burnt to the ground right around the time of Jesus' birth that we saw in the last video. And then here, speaking of the last video, is a map of all of Israel. So here is where Jesus ministered for the most part before beginning his trip with his disciples down to Jerusalem near the end of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where he is prepared to take up his cross and die. Here's a couple quick aerial views, kind of cool to see Capernaum here, Bethsaida, the mountain where Jesus apparently gave the Beatitudes. So you see those cities. Here's Capernaum, right on the Sea of Galilee. You see pictured right there. And another shot from the southeast. A couple of pictures of synagogues or reconstructions, remains of what synagogues, Jewish centers of worship would have looked like. So where Jesus did a lot of his teaching, we'll see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke in those Galilee synagogues. And then here's a boat, the first century boat that Jesus and his disciples would have spent a lot of time in, going place to place, where Jesus ends up doing some miracles, we'll see as well, involved with the Sea of Galilee, being out on the water. So that's sort of an introduction to the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew, as we finish up, just a few introductory thoughts on Matthew. The gospel is actually anonymous, and really all the gospels are anonymous. They never say, I, Matthew, wrote this, or Mark, or Luke, or John. But from very early on in church history, early church fathers like Papias, Irenaeus, they attribute it to Matthew. That was the tradition that grew up around this gospel. Matthew, the apostle, wrote it sometime within those dates right there, 65 to 80 AD. Some unique or distinct characteristics of Matthew. He includes a lot of kingdom or royalty language. It's written to Jews. This is especially important. Written to Jews to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. We'll take a look at this very structured genealogy in just a minute. The genealogy being the royal line of David. A lot of teachings that Matthew includes on the kingdom of heaven, and that's something distinct. Mark and Luke, Jesus always calls it the kingdom of God, but Matthew, being a very observant Jew writing to a Jewish audience, realizes that a lot of Jews don't want to say the name of God out loud, and so he actually substitutes heaven for God. Kind of interesting. And then especially this last one as well, shows more than any other gospel, more than any of the synoptics or John, how Jesus fulfills Old Testament prophecy. Matthew, more than any other, has the most prophecies that he talks about from the Old Testament that Jesus fulfills. So here's that genealogy. 14 generations from Abraham to David, from David to the exile, and from the exile to the Messiah. And here's the angel's words to Joseph. She will give birth to a son, name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. So the message being, right as Matthew begins, for his Jewish audience, in Jesus, the exile is finally, fully ending. His purpose to encourage, to confirm persecuted Jewish Christians in their faith, and again, to go back to this prophecy theme, to prove and to show that the gospel of Jesus is not contradicting Old Testament teaching, but it's actually, if you have eyes to see, a fulfillment of the promises made to Abraham and a tool to share your faith, an evangelistic tool to Jews who might be looking at Jesus wondering, is he really the Messiah? Is he really the guy that we've been looking for based on the Old Testament? It's got a fairly simple but unique and important structure. So first of all, you can break it down into two possibly. He's got a public ministry, Jesus does, in the first part of Matthew, preaching publicly, teaching publicly, and then in the second half of the book, more privately speaking and teaching to his disciples. That way of dividing it into two, though, you can also expand, importantly, into 5 sections. Oops, and I skipped back there. 5 sections. So just take a look at that. I won't go point by point through those, but there's a reason that Matthew divided up his story of Jesus into 5 particular sections, and I want you to reflect on that a moment. So to wrap up, for Matthew especially, his unique story, Jesus is the new and better Moses, writing to a Jewish audience, structuring his gospel in 5 sections to reflect the Pentateuch. Jesus, the new and better Moses, is the story that we'll see Matthew is telling in his gospel.